How's it going everyone, Spenny here, back with another video. Today, we're going to be talking about the Ken and Barbie killers of Scarborough, Ontario, Canada. This was an extremely well-known case, at least for me and around my area, because it was only an hour and a half away from where these events occurred. This was actually the original propaganda that parents used for decades now, trying to teach their children about being safe in public and avoiding talking to strangers and people that they don't know. I know that ever since this happened, which was the late 90s, parents have been way more careful about how they let their children go about their daily lives. If there's one good thing to realize and take home from this whole case, I think it's that people are a lot more safe now when it comes to being around strangers. The events described in this case are absolutely brutal, and my heart goes out to all those who were affected. And with that being said, this will be kind of graphic, so please watch at your own discretion. There's going to be a few words that I can't exactly say on YouTube, understandably, because they're quite harsh and brutal terms, so I will have to censor them out, but when needed I will be showing them down on screen what I'm actually talking about. So without further ado, let's get right into the video. First, the backstory. Paul Bernardo was born August 27, 1964, and was known as a boy who always loved to smile and have fun. However, as he grew older, he ended up actually taking a liking to humiliating women, beating the woman who he dated, as well as he started to have some quite dark fantasies revolving around women as well. Instead of reading a Bible like some people when they are going kind of on the wrong path, he actually chose the literature of American Psycho, which is a very weird book to kind of take a liking to. He was said to bring this book basically everywhere he went, and he would always refer back to it. It pretty much never left his side. The story revolves around a young stockbroker who, as the story progresses, begins to act on his psychopathic thoughts and impulses. When Paul turned 16 years old, his mother came forward about something that she was actually hiding from him all those years, and it actually was about him and his biological father. Paul found out that he was actually conceived when his mother had an affair with another man, and after hearing this, he lost all respect for his mother and started brutally harassing her. Paul attended school in his later life at the University of Toronto in 1982. He worked for Amway, which sold beauty and home care products, and he was heavily influenced by get-rich-quick schemes, and he always wanted to become both rich and famous, both of which he would get neither of, but he would hit the mainstream media and news for reasons unrelated. Paul and his friends from university would quite frequently always go to bars and try and practice their pickup lines on women. And apparently they were quite successful, according to some sources. The beginning. There were at least 19 known non-fatal accidents that occurred at the hands of Paul, and I can't believe I have to differentiate the incidents like this between non-fatal and fatal, but you'll get the point. These 19 cases that are all documented occurred from 1987 to 1990. Most of these occurred in the Scarborough area and were all cases of either attempted SA or just flat out SA. He was known to have stalked his victims by watching them get off buses, and as these children came home from school, he would attack them. His victims ranged from children in their early teens all the way to women in their early 20s. Most of these cases started out by Paul actually going to these people's homes and attempting SA. And I say attempting because thankfully, in a good amount of these cases that were documented, parents did find their child at home with him and they chased him away. These parents, for the most part, would go to the police, but they didn't know who he was and neither did their children, so they had a hard time actually figuring out who Paul was. Paul often threatened all of his victims with a knife, and I can't even imagine if I was a parent what I would do if I came home and this man was with children. In 1990, police submitted over 130 samples of evidence in hopes of catching this weirdo. Prior to these incidents, Paul was actually suspected for an R-word case on a woman, but it was later dismissed for unknown reasons. I can't believe they really almost had him and they just dismissed the case without even looking any further into it. He was scheduled for an interview and they called it off, and I guess he was no longer a suspect of interest. And that's bad, but that's not all. A victim by the name of Anthony Hainmeyer was convicted of Paul's fourth documented case of SA, for which he had to serve 16 years in prison for until he was able to prove his innocence. That's insane. Imagine being falsely accused for one of someone else's crimes and having to serve 16 years of your life in prison. That's unbelievable. In October of 1987, Paul met Karla Homolka, and they were nearly instantly attracted to each other. Unfortunately, she did not really help his case, being that she actually encouraged his sadistic behaviors. This was exactly the partner he needed in order to help him fulfill his darkest fantasies, which would commence in May of that same year. From one offender to two killers. Paul often spent most of his free time with Karla at her parents' house, who loved him. They were extremely happy when they announced their engagement, and were really excited for them. Karla had a younger sister that also lived at that house named Tammy, and Paul was often seen flirting with her. And that's not it. She was also 15 years old. Paul quickly became obsessed with Tammy and would often peer into her windows at night. And I can't believe I read this right, and this is disgusting. But Paul would also, while Tammy was asleep, walk into her room and tug on his third leg. Words can't even describe how disgusting this is. And the worst part is, Karla actually knew about all of this and encouraged this behavior. She actually broke Tammy, her own sister's windows, in order to allow him easier access to get into her room at night. Karla would also mix a drug called Valium into spaghetti sauce quite often, in hopes of getting her younger sister to eat it so that she would be drugged for Paul. 6 months prior to their wedding, Karla would actually steal an anesthetic from an animal clinic in order to go along with a rum, eggnog, and sleeping pill cocktail that they would attempt to give to Karla's sister, Tammy. It was nearing Christmas, and Karla wanted to get something for Paul, something special and memorable, and it's fucking disgusting. I can't believe that this stuff actually happened. Karla wanted to give her sister's V-card to Paul, and no, Tammy did not know about this. Paul was disgustingly excited about all this. I really hope, just to get the point across, that you remember that they are sisters. One older sister is doing this to her younger sister, trying to get her drugged and assaulted. After Tammy was drugged, Paul and Karla would take turns R-wording Tammy. And if that wasn't bad enough, they also videotaped the entire encounter. Following the act, Tammy started vomiting, which she would end up choking on. They tried to revive her and call 911 after relocating her body to her own bedroom. So this extra time probably could have been used to save her if they didn't relocate her to her room. They had to take all the time to clean up the area and everything before they made that 911 call. So, as you can expect, unfortunately Tammy would not make it, and she would eventually pass away at the St. Catherine's General Hospital. She never regained consciousness. All of this happened while Karla's parents were actually asleep upstairs. The parents did recall that they heard them doing laundry and vacuuming at the late hours of the night, which is already suspicious. But also, Tammy had burns on her face from a type of chloroform that they put over her nose and mouth in order to knock her out. And the chemical burns weren't actually further looked into, and they ignored them. And basically, the examiner said that it was an accident, and she just partied too hard, drank too much alcohol, and ended up choking on her own vomit and dying. What's even crazier about this is even after Karla's own sister died at her own hands, she had little to no remorse and would even roleplay in the bedroom as her sister, wearing all of her clothes with Paul. As a result of this incident, Karla and Paul would then buy their own house and move out of Karla's parents' house in order to give them time to grieve. Together, they would purchase a bungalow located in Port Dalhousie. This was just the beginning. So this is where the story starts to get way more bizarre, and that's insane because it's already crazy. But as you could expect, they had a lot more free time now, moving out on their own. There's no parents to look out for, and it's just them two. They can pretty much do whatever they want unless they're suspected of anything by the authorities, which they weren't. And this brings me to the thing about the Ken and Barbie killers. If their names aren't Ken and Barbie, why was that their nickname? Well, they were called the Ken and Barbie killers because of how perfect a couple they seemed. Everybody thought that they were the cutest couple, and they looked great together. They seemed to act very romantic in public, and no one expected anything of them. Hence the name Ken and Barbie, after the dolls, which are the perfect couple. In 1991, Carla would invite her old friend who she met at a pet store, Jane Doe, whose name is undisclosed, over to her house for dinner. Once she was invited over, she was drugged, assaulted, as well as videotaped. She did eventually make it out pretty much unharmed, other than the fact she was violated. But for an odd reason, this is probably why she doesn't want her name disclosed, is because a month later, she would get invited back again, and she would actually go. The next time though, she wasn't as lucky. The next time she went back, she would end up getting drugged once again and vomiting. Paul and Carla had to call 911. She would end up being resuscitated at the hospital, and she ended up making it out alive, thankfully. But I don't know how this wasn't a red flag. This would be the second case in a year where someone almost choked and died, and that is a little bit suspicious to me, but I don't know, I guess police had a different understanding of it. Early one morning in 1991, Paul was out just trying to steal some license plates, for God knows why, but that's besides the point. This is when he found Leslie Mahaffey, a 14-year-old student who missed her curfew, and as her punishment, her parents locked her out of her own house. Paul left his car and kind of jokingly said to Leslie that he was trying to break into her neighbor's house because he saw that she was out kind of on her front porch and she wasn't being let in. She laughed at this and asked for a pack of cigarettes, to which he said, "Yeah, sure, they're in my car." They would both walk over to the car, but unfortunately, Paul would actually blindfold her and restrain her and put her in the car and drive her home, back where Carla was also waiting. The acts were even more brutal than those before. They tied her up, and not only did they SA her, but they also tortured her, and yet again, videotaped her. All these victims were, for some reason, after this point, videotaped every single time. It's just so weird because you would think that if they were smart criminals, they wouldn't leave any evidence behind, but I guess they didn't really care. It was not clear what the original outcome was supposed to be for Leslie, but Carla said to Paul, "I think Leslie's blindfold was slipping off at some point, and I think she saw who we were, so now we're identifiable." And this would be the downfall for Leslie. They could no longer, at least to their discretion, let her get away. What happens next is kinda unclear because there's two different sides of the story, but Leslie ended up either being strangled to death by Paul, or she was given a lethal dose of a drug by Carla. This would unfortunately kill Leslie, and Paul and Carla ended up hiding her body in the basement until they realized what they were gonna do with it. A few days later, Paul would go to the basement with a saw and cement that he purchased from a hardware store. He would then brutally dismember the body and encase it all in cement blocks. It took them multiple trips to drop off all of these cement blocks, as they probably were quite heavy. They ended up being thrown into Lake Gibson, where they were actually recovered later on that year. A mother and a son were actually on a fishing trip and ended up stumbling across these cement blocks with parts encased in them. They would report this to authorities, and later on that year, they did identify that it was Leslie's body. Encased in the cement was also Leslie's orthodontic appliance, which helped police and authorities be able to identify it being Leslie. In April of the next year, Paul and Carla were driving around St. Catharines looking for their next victim. This is when they spotted 15-year-old Kristen French walking quickly to her nearby home. They would pull into a parking lot a ways away from Kristen where she was walking towards, and they would ask her for directions. Carla would hop out of the car with a map and ask her where they were because they were lost, or so they said. Once they were both looking at the map, Paul would walk around the car and end up striking Kristen. Then he would brandish a knife in order to make her not scream or run away. They forced Kristen in the car with them, and she actually sat in the passenger seat, and Carla would hold her back by her hair from the back seats of the car. Later that day, Kristen's parents actually filed a missing persons report when they would eventually find Kristen actually lost her shoe in this encounter, which made it that much more important to find her. They realized that she must have been captured in a struggle, meaning that she was abducted. Carla and Paul would eventually do the same things they did to the very last victim. Kristen was said to have been a fighter, and good on her, because I don't know if I would be able to do that in that type of scenario. But she was unfortunately forced to actually drink large quantities of alcohol to get her to actually obey Paul and Carla. The next day, they unfortunately killed Kristen and threw her in a ditch nearby the cemetery where Leslie, the previous victim, was actually buried. Prior to getting rid of the body, Carla actually cut off all of Kristen's hair and cleaned the body. These were surprisingly the only 3 deaths to have occurred at the hands of both Paul and Carla. However, there were many more victims who were either assaulted and got away, or just flat out escaped Paul and Carla. Not all of them were named, but the majority of these people were actually high school students. Leading up to the arrest, Paul and Carla were actually seen as possible victims for these murders. They tried to actually change their names to Thiel. The reason why this was such a dumb thing to do, and by the way, they both wanted to change their names to Thiel. It's very weird. The backstory on the name Thiel is that it was a serial killer from the film Criminal Law. It really didn't have to take this long if they would have just caught them in the first place when they had the chance. But I guess if this is what it took, better late than never. A few months later in December, Paul's DNA was tested and sampled and sent off to a lab in hopes of seeing if it was a match with the murderer. It was at this time when Paul started being questioned about if he was the murderer when Carla actually changed sides. Carla claimed that she was manipulated and used and also beaten during the duration of their whole marriage. This is when she would attempt to file charges against Paul. 26 months later, Paul's DNA samples came back as positive. He was the murderer and they had finally caught him. He was placed under 24-hour surveillance. Before this, in the duration of while he was waiting for his DNA to be tested, he did attempt to commit suicide, but he sent a note to a friend, and I guess this friend actually did stop him, which is very fortunate because he deserves to rot in jail. Carla would still stick to her story about being abused by Paul. Carla told the police that she would tell them absolutely everything they wanted to know, but only under the circumstances that she would be legally immune. On one hand, yes, you want to know everything that happened, and it would be helpful to have someone on your side that knew him the most. But the problem with this is, as I'm sure you can see, she wasn't innocent, and her wanting to be immune to the law really doesn't make a lot of sense. Once Paul was arrested, the police did finally have a warrant to search his property. The problem was they weren't allowed to actually do an in-depth search. They couldn't rearrange his property, and they weren't allowed to make any damage onto the house. The police were able to find a few things here and there, but nothing really important. And this was because there was someone behind the scenes doing stuff for Paul. So remember those videotapes and the video footage I talked about that documented everything they did? Well, Paul's lawyer actually went to the house prior to the search and hid all of those tapes in a light fixture in the house, so they were never found by the police. This is very important because if they had this footage to look at, they would have seen that Carla was not innocent, and she partook in a lot of the events that occurred. For unknown reasons, Paul's lawyer would eventually resign, and when he did this, he would turn over all the tapes as evidence. The Canadian government gave Carla a 12-year plea deal and gave her 1 week to accept. This would mean that no matter what happened in the case, she would only have to serve 12 years in prison, which she would of course later agree to. If she declined, she would likely have gotten life in prison. So this would mean that Carla would effectively be a snitch and snitch on everything that Paul had ever done. This would include all of the murders, all of the essays, and all of his stalking. She would also explain how she knew of over 30 crimes that were actually committed that the police didn't know about. They originally thought there was only under 10. So at this point in time, when the deal was accepted, the 12-year deal, the police and the government did not know about her involvement. They didn't know that she was in the tapes, so later on, when they were handed those tapes and had to look them over, they were baffled at what they saw. They saw basically Carla doing everything Paul was doing, and they couldn't take back this deal. So she would only get 12 years in prison, and then she would be released. The trial. In 1995, Paul's trial began for the involvement in the murders of Leslie and Kristen. During this trial, they actually had to play and watch the video footage of what happened to them. And with the parents being there, I can't even imagine the emotions that they were going through. I would be disgusted and overall angry. Paul was eventually sentenced to 25 years to life in prison, and after the 25 years are up, he's eligible to actually apply for parole every 2 years. He actually just recently, last year, got denied for parole for the second time in a row, and he was mad that he couldn't get out of prison, and he said he was a changed man. But people on the inside said it wasn't actually that. After the first time he was denied parole 4 years ago, he was said to have stopped caring about the murders, stopped being sorry for what he did, and he actually stopped taking classes, which apparently you have to take there when you are an offender. This just goes to show that he is a high risk, and that's what they ruled him. They said he's a high risk and he should never get out, because he will definitely do the same thing over again, especially if he's not sorry for what he's done, and especially if he's still having these dark thoughts. Paul is now kept in the Kingston Penitentiary, and for his own safety, he's in segregation. I'm sure many other inmates would want to have a little chat with him about what he's done. Prior to him being moved into segregation, he was reportedly beaten and harassed on the daily, which, sure, good. Like, that's perfect. I don't know what else you would expect for someone like him. As for Carla, she was given the 12-year deal, and she is now out of prison, and she has been for a while now. Pretty much all Canadians criticize the government for what they did in this case. They made it so that she is a free woman to do whatever she wants and faces no repercussions from what happened. In 2005, Carla was now 35 and was released from prison. That was a long time ago now, and she was actually mad that she didn't have privacy after she was released from prison, stating that she couldn't get on with her own life. She said, and I quote, "I don't want people to think I'm dangerous and I'm going to do something to their children. I think of what I've done and I don't think I deserve to be happy." So, yeah, you don't deserve to be happy, meaning you don't deserve your own privacy. You lost the right to that. In 2017, it was reported that Carla changed her name to Leanne, and you'll never guess what her last name is now. Leanne Thiel, the frickin' murderer last name from the movie. Like, what? Why? This is a red flag, and there's not any actual evidence tying her to any crimes now in present day, or that she's done anything ever again since she was released. That's her new last name. Very classy. And yes, she has children now, and a husband. I don't know who would want to marry this woman, but I don't know. All I can say is hopefully he knows who she actually is. She was reportedly working as a volunteer at her children's school, and parents were upset with that, and she did have to relocate. So yeah, now she's living in Quebec with her husband and children and living a normal life. That's just insane to me. I don't think it's deserved whatsoever, but that's just my opinion. But I believe everyone should have the same opinion. If you think she shouldn't be in prison for life, I don't even know what to say. And that's gonna do it for the video. I'd like to thank everyone so much for watching. This was only my second video on the channel. I know, it's kinda crazy. I'm aiming honestly to push out content at least a few times a month. These videos do take a lot of research and time to make, but overall I think they're worth it and I'm very happy with how they're turning out. We got some amazing feedback from the last video I posted. If you haven't seen it, definitely go watch it. It is my only other video on this channel. I'm very happy with how these videos are turning out, and as I make more, hopefully they do get better. This one I can already tell it's gonna be way better than the first one. You guys can tell me what you think in the comments. And a huge thanks goes out to all of my Patreon members and supporters. If you want to know more about how to become a Patreon member and a member of the channel, all that information will be linked down in the description of the video. And if you haven't already, please don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe, and I'll see you guys all in the next one. Thanks for watching.